There are moments that divide a life into before and after, and Eleanor Ashworth had learned to count hers not in years, but in the precise number of days since she had been declared unlovable before half of London society, 1,096 days to be exact, though she would never admit to anyone that she kept such a tally, that each morning upon waking she added another mark to the invisible ledger of her humiliation. The memory lived in her body as much as her mind. Lady Pemberton's garden party, the roses in full bloom filling the air with their cloying sweetness, the afternoon light golden and warm as she had walked toward Lord Clarence Whitmore, with her heart so full of hope it nearly choked her, believing, foolish, foolish girl, that he meant to propose at last after a season of devoted courtship, of whispered promises and lingering glances that had made her believe herself worthy of love. She could still see the way his pale blue eyes had flickered with something cold as she approached, the way his smile had sharpened into something cruel, the way he had pitched his voice to carry when he spoke. "My dear Miss Ashworth, surely you did not imagine I would actually marry you. A woman of your limited charms requires substantial compensation to be considered marriageable. Without fortune, you are simply unlovable. I require a wife who brings value, and you, I fear, bring nothing at all." The word had hung in the rose-scented air, unlovable, and the world had contracted to the sound of whispers erupting around her like startled birds, to the rustle of silk as ladies leaned toward one another behind their fans, to the terrible weight of dozens of eyes upon her as Clarence turned and walked away to court an heiress, leaving her standing alone on the manicured lawn with her heart in ruins at her feet. She had not wept, not then. She had lifted her chin and walked to her carriage with her shoulders straight, and her hands clasped before her, as if she could hold herself together through sheer force of will. And she had not allowed herself to shatter, until she was safely behind closed doors, where no one could witness her devastation. Now, 1,096 days later, Eleanor sat in the small sitting-room of the modest London townhouse her family could barely afford, reviewing household accounts in a dress 2 seasons out of fashion, the afternoon light thin and grey through windows that needed cleaning. The figures before her told a familiar story of careful economies and quiet desperation, of a life grown smaller with each passing year. A curl had escaped its pins near her left temple. It always did when she was distressed, and she tucked it back absently as she set down her pen and moved to the window, watching carriages pass on the street below, carrying ladies to calls and gentlemen to clubs, all of them living lives that had once seemed within her reach. She pressed her right thumb firmly against the inside of her left wrist, feeling her pulse steady beneath the pressure, a habit she had developed in the days after the garden party when she needed to remind herself that she was still alive, still breathing, still somehow continuing despite everything. The sitting-room door opened, and Mrs. Dawson entered with the tea tray, her grey hair pinned beneath a sensible cap, her eyes sharp with the particular knowing concern of a woman who had been Eleanor's governess before becoming her lady's maid. "A letter has arrived from your father, Miss Eleanor," Mrs. Dawson said carefully, setting down the tray with deliberate precision. "It was marked urgent." Eleanor's thumb pressed harder against her wrist as she turned from the window, and the small beauty mark below her right cheekbone, the one Clarence had once called common, seemed to darken against skin gone suddenly pale. The letter trembled in Eleanor's hands as she read it once, twice, 3 times, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating if she only looked at them long enough, but they remained stubbornly, terribly fixed upon the page. The final investments had failed, the creditors were circling, and within the month they would lose everything. Not merely the modest comforts they had clung to these past 3 years, but the very roof above their heads, the worn chairs with their faded upholstery, the small garden where nothing grew any more because they could not afford a gardener. All of it swept away into the maw of debt and disgrace. She set the letter down with hands that had gone cold and still, and for a long moment she simply sat in the gathering dusk of the sitting room, watching the shadows lengthen across the threadbare carpet, feeling the weight of ruin settle upon her shoulders like a familiar shawl. Her father had not been able to tell her himself. He had written it in his cramped, shaking hand, rather than speak the words aloud. And that cowardice, born of love, she knew, born of his desperate wish to protect her from pain, told her more about his state than any letter could. She rose, smoothing her outdated dress with automatic hands, and made her way through the narrow hallway to his study, where she knew she would find him, where she had found him so many evenings since her mother's death 2 years past, sitting among his books with their covers growing dusty because he no longer had the heart to read them. The door was ajar, and through the gap she could see him hunched in his chair before the cold fireplace. They could not afford to light it except on the coldest nights, and in his hands he held the small portrait of her mother that usually sat upon his desk, and his shoulders were shaking with the silent sobs of a man who has lost everything and knows it. Eleanor pressed her thumb hard against the inside of her wrist, feeling her pulse jump beneath the pressure, and then she pushed open the door and went to him, kneeling beside his chair as she had done when she was a child, taking his weathered hand in both of hers. "Papa," she said softly, and he looked at her with red-rimmed eyes, with the face of a man drowning in guilt and grief, and she saw that he had aged a decade in the months since she had last truly looked at him. "I would rather die than force you into an arrangement that would cause you pain, my dear," he whispered, his voice cracking on the words. "But I fear I am dying regardless, and I cannot bear to leave you with nothing." He told her then, haltingly, about the man who had approached him, a duke of all things, wealthy beyond measure, seeking a wife for reasons her father did not fully understand, offering a settlement that would clear their debts and leave her father comfortable for whatever years remained to him. Eleanor listened, with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles went white, and she thought of her mother's white camellias that had once bloomed in the garden of their old home, before everything had changed, and she thought of the word that had followed her for 1,096 days, unlovable, and she made herself a promise in the silence of her heart. She would accept this arrangement, whatever it was, because she had no choice, because her father needed her, because there would be no other offers for a dowryless woman with a ruined reputation. She would be grateful. She would be content. She would never be foolish enough to hope for more, and she would never, ever allow herself to love him. That way lies only fresh humiliation. The Ashford townhouse rose before them like a monument to everything Eleanor had lost, its pale stone facade gleaming in the weak morning light, its windows tall and imposing, its iron railings polished to a shine that spoke of wealth so secure it need not announce itself. And as Eleanor climbed the steps beside her father, his hand trembling where it gripped her arm, his breath coming short from the exertion of pretending he was not terrified, she found herself cataloguing every detail as if committing them to memory might somehow prepare her for what awaited within. She had dressed with care in her best remaining gown, a dove-grey silk that had been fashionable 3 seasons past, and Mrs. Dawson had pinned her chestnut hair with particular attention, tucking that wayward curl firmly into place, though Eleanor suspected it would escape before the interview was over, as it always did when she was distressed. The butler who admitted them was immaculate and expressionless, leading them through a marble entrance hall and into a drawing-room so elegantly appointed that Eleanor had to resist the urge to clasp her hands before her like a supplicant. Instead, she kept her shoulders straight and her chin level, drawing on reserves of dignity she had not known she still possessed. Her father lowered himself into a chair with poorly concealed relief, his face grey with exhaustion, and Eleanor remained standing, her grey-green eyes taking in the room, the silk wallpaper, the crystal chandelier, the paintings in their gilded frames. until the door opened and the man who would decide her fate walked in, and everything she had prepared herself to expect dissolved like morning mist. He was tall, taller than any man she had encountered, broad-shouldered and lean, with the build of someone who used his body rather than merely inhabiting it, and his dark eyes swept the room with an assessment so thorough she felt it like a physical touch when his gaze found her. She had expected someone old, perhaps cruel, certainly indifferent. What she had not expected was this: a man perhaps 8 years her senior, with a face that might have been carved from stone for all the warmth it showed, and yet there was something in the set of his jaw, in the way his large hands hung at his sides, that suggested depths she could not begin to fathom. He smelled of sandalwood and cedar, with an undertone of leather, and the scent reached her as he crossed the room, stirring something in her chest that she firmly refused to examine. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice was a deep baritone, clipped and precise, offering nothing. "Mr. Ashworth, I am Thornton." He did not sit, and so neither did Eleanor, and for a long moment they simply looked at one another while her father murmured something grateful and nervous that neither of them seemed to hear. The Duke of Thornton outlined his requirements with the same clinical precision one might use to discuss the purchase of a horse. He must marry before his 33rd birthday, or forfeit substantial estates to a distant cousin, per the terms of his late father's will. He had no interest in love, romance, or any of the attendant complications. He had observed her at a musicale 2 months prior and found her demeanour acceptable. He offered security, comfort, the protection of his name and title, and a settlement that would clear her father's debts and ensure his comfort for whatever years remained to him. His voice never warmed, his expression never shifted, and his thumb moved absently across a thin scar on his right knuckles as he spoke, the only sign that he was anything other than perfectly composed. When he finished, Eleanor asked the only question that mattered. "Why me, Your Grace, when you might have any heiress in London?" He looked at her then, truly looked, and for the space of a heartbeat his dark eyes met her grey-green ones, with something that was not coldness, but rather its opposite, a recognition, perhaps, of wounds that matched her own. "Because you will not pretend to love me, Miss Ashworth," he said quietly, "and I find I prefer honesty to performance." The silence that followed his words stretched between them like a held breath, and Eleanor found herself studying the Duke of Thornton with new eyes, not the eyes of a woman assessing her jailer, but those of someone who had glimpsed, however briefly, a crack in an otherwise impenetrable facade, for there had been something in his voice when he spoke of honesty, something that suggested he, too, had been wounded by its absence. And she wondered, fleetingly, what performances had been demanded of him that he should value their lack so highly. Her father shifted in his chair, and the small sound seemed to recall the Duke to the business at hand, for his jaw tightened in that way she was beginning to recognize as a precursor to decision, and when he spoke again his voice had regained its formal precision. "I give you my word, Miss Ashworth, that you shall never want for anything within my power to provide. I shall ensure your comfort, your security, and your protection. I ask nothing of you but the use of my name." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, each one sending ripples through Eleanor's carefully constructed composure, and she pressed her right thumb firmly against the inside of her left wrist, feeling her pulse jump beneath the pressure as she considered what he was offering. Not love, certainly, not even affection, but safety, stability, an end to the grinding fear that had become her constant companion these past 3 years. "I accept, Your Grace," she heard herself say, and her voice was steady, which surprised her, for inside she felt as though she were standing at the edge of a precipice, preparing to step into empty air. Her father made a sound that might have been relief or grief or some complicated mixture of both, and the Duke inclined his head in acknowledgment, and somewhere beyond the tall windows thunder rumbled in the distance, the first warning of an approaching storm. They discussed practicalities then. The wedding would be quiet, held within the fortnight. Her father's debts would be settled immediately. She would want for nothing. And throughout it all, Eleanor watched the Duke's hands, watched the way his thumb moved absently across the scar on his knuckles, whenever the conversation touched upon anything that might be construed as personal, and she filed this observation away, as one might file away a clue to a puzzle not yet understood. When they rose to leave, he did something unexpected. He asked if there was anything she required before the wedding, anything at all, and when she said no, for what could she possibly ask of this stranger who was purchasing her future? He paused, and something flickered in those dark, impenetrable eyes. "If you think of anything," he said quietly, "you need only ask." It was not warm precisely, but neither was it unkind, and Eleanor carried that small distinction with her, like a talisman, as the carriage bore them home through the first fat drops of rain. That evening she sat with Mrs. Dawson in her small chamber, the storm now raging properly beyond the windows, and confessed her fears, that she was trading one cage for another, that she would be lonely in a grand house with a cold husband, that she had sold herself for security, and would spend the rest of her days paying the price. Mrs. Dawson listened with the patience of long affection, and when Eleanor had exhausted herself, the older woman spoke with quiet conviction. "If I may say so, miss, a man's character shows not in his words at a ball, but in his silence when he thinks no one observes. Watch him, my dear. Watch what he does when he believes himself unwatched, and you may find he is not quite the man he presents to the world." Eleanor nodded, though she did not quite believe it, and after Mrs. Dawson had gone, she reached for the worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets that had been her mother's, running her fingers over the familiar leather binding before opening to a page at random, seeking comfort in words that had survived centuries. She read until her eyes grew heavy, and when sleep finally claimed her, the book lay open upon her chest to Sonnet 116. "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments," and outside the storm raged on, indifferent to the small hopes and fears of those who sheltered from its fury. The journey from London to Derbyshire had taken the better part of 2 days, and Eleanor had spent much of it in a state of suspended disbelief, watching the countryside transform from the familiar grey sprawl of the city to rolling green hills and ancient forests that seemed to belong to another world entirely, a world in which she was somehow now a duchess, though the title sat upon her shoulders like a garment made for someone else, ill-fitting and strange. Henry had ridden alongside the carriage for much of the first day, and when he had joined her inside as evening fell, they had sat in silence that was not quite comfortable, but not quite hostile either, a silence filled with questions neither of them seemed ready to ask, and she had feigned sleep for a time simply to avoid the weight of his dark, unreadable gaze, though she had felt it upon her none the less, a warmth she could not explain, and did not wish to examine. When Thornton Hall finally came into view on the afternoon of the second day, Eleanor pressed her face to the carriage window like a child, unable to contain her astonishment, for the estate was grander than anything she had imagined in her most ambitious dreams, a vast stone edifice of honey-coloured walls and countless windows that caught the afternoon light and threw it back like scattered diamonds, surrounded by gardens that stretched toward the horizon in carefully cultivated waves of green and gold, with a lake glittering in the middle distance, and ancient oaks standing sentinel along the drive. She was still staring, her grey-green eyes wide with wonder, when the carriage rolled to a stop before the great front doors, and a woman emerged to greet them, A woman of perhaps 60 years with silver hair swept elegantly back from a face that bore the unmistakable stamp of aristocratic breeding, sharp-featured and keen-eyed, with a mouth that seemed perpetually poised on the edge of either a smile or a cutting remark. "So this is the woman who has finally convinced my nephew to fulfill his obligations?" the Dowager Duchess Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly across the gravel drive as Henry handed Eleanor down from the carriage, and Eleanor felt herself being assessed with the same thoroughness she imagined a jeweller might apply to an uncut stone. "I am pleased to meet you, Your Grace," Eleanor managed, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest, and the Dowager's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "My dear child, you must call me Margaret, or Aunt, if you prefer. We are family now, after all, and I have waited far too long to have another woman in this house with whom I might have sensible conversation." She turned to Henry then, reaching up to pat his cheek with a familiarity that seemed to startle him. "My dear nephew, you have spent so long building walls that you have forgotten you built a door. Perhaps it is time to remember where you put the key." Henry's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, merely offered his arm to Eleanor and led her inside, through a grand entrance hall with marble floors and a sweeping staircase, past footmen and maids who bowed and curtsied with expressions of carefully concealed curiosity, until they reached a suite of rooms on the east wing that overlooked the gardens below. "These are your chambers," he said, his voice clipped and formal once more, and Eleanor stepped inside to find a sitting room decorated in soft blues and creams, with tall windows that flooded the space with light, and beyond it a bedchamber that was larger than the entire ground floor of her family's London townhouse. She moved to the window, drawn by the view, and there below her she saw them, white camellias, dozens of them, blooming in profusion along a garden path. "My mother grew camellias," she said softly, almost to herself, the words escaping before she could stop them. "White ones, just like these. They remind me of home, before everything changed." She did not turn, but she felt Henry pause at the door, felt the weight of his gaze upon her back. And when she finally looked around, he was watching her with an expression she could not read, something flickering in those dark eyes that was there and gone before she could name it. "I hope you will be comfortable," he said, and then he was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of sandalwood and cedar, and the echo of words unspoken. That evening, as Mrs. Dawson helped her prepare for bed, Eleanor found a single white camellia resting upon her dressing table, its petals perfect and unblemished, placed there by an unknown hand, with no note, no acknowledgement, nothing to indicate its origin, and yet she knew with a certainty she could not explain exactly who had left it there, and she pressed her thumb to her wrist and wondered what it meant that her pulse had quickened at the sight of it. The library, de bien dead. Thornton Hall had become Eleanor's sanctuary in the week since her arrival, a vast cathedral of books and silence, where the afternoon light fell through tall windows in great golden shafts that illuminated dust motes dancing like tiny stars, and where the scent of aged leather bindings and old paper mingled with something she had come to recognize as the lingering trace of sandalwood and cedar, a ghost of her husband's presence that seemed to permeate the very walls of this room he so clearly loved. She had established a routine, as one does when seeking to make a strange place feel less strange, and each afternoon found her curled in one of the deep leather chairs near the window, her mother's worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets open in her lap, though her eyes often drifted from the familiar verses to wander across the endless shelves that climbed toward the ceiling, wondering what other treasures might be hidden among their ranks. It was on such an afternoon, when the light had begun to turn from gold to amber, and the house had settled into that particular hush that precedes evening, that she heard footsteps in the corridor and looked up to find Henry standing in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the dimmer hall beyond, and something in his expression suggested he had not expected to find her there, that he had perhaps sought the same solitude she had claimed. "Forgive me," he said, his voice carrying that clipped formality she had come to recognize as his armor. "I did not mean to disturb you." And he made as if to withdraw. But Eleanor found herself speaking before she could think better of it, asking about a volume she had noticed on one of the higher shelves, a collection of poetry she could not reach, and the words hung between them like an invitation neither had quite intended. He crossed the room without comment, his long stride eating the distance between the door and the shelves, and she watched him reach up with an ease that spoke of his considerable height, his fingers closing around the spine of the book she had indicated, and when he turned to hand it to her, their fingers brushed in the transfer, his skin warm against hers, and the world seemed to contract to that single point of contact. She felt the heat of his hand, noticed for the first time the thin scar that crossed his right knuckles, pale against his skin. And when she raised her eyes to his face, she found him looking at her with an expression she had never seen before, his dark eyes no longer impenetrable but startled, almost vulnerable, as though he too had felt the current that passed between them in that briefest of touches. He pulled back as if burned, his thumb moving instinctively to trace the scar on his knuckles, and he cleared his throat with a sound that seemed too loud in the sudden silence. "I trust you will find it to your liking," he said. And then he was gone, his footsteps retreating down the corridor with a haste that belied his usual, measured pace, leaving Eleanor alone with the book pressed against her chest and her heart racing beneath it, her right thumb finding the pulse point at her left wrist and pressing firmly as she reminded herself of the promise she had made, that she would not love him, that she would not be foolish enough to hope for more than the security he had offered. But that night, as she lay in her grand bed in her beautiful chambers, she could not stop thinking about the warmth of his hand and the way his eyes had looked in that unguarded moment, and she knew with a sinking certainty that her promise was already in danger of being broken. The morning had dawned bright and clear, the kind of spring day that seemed to wash the world in gold and green, and Eleanor had found herself restless in a way she could not quite name, her thoughts returning again and again to the library, to the warmth of his hand, to the way his dark eyes had looked at her in that unguarded moment before he had retreated behind his walls once more, and so she had taken herself out of doors, walking the grounds of Thornton Hall with no particular destination in mind, simply needing to move, to breathe, to escape the confines of her own treacherous heart. She had wandered past the formal gardens, where the white camellias bloomed in profusion, past the ornamental lake, where swans glided in stately pairs, and found herself approaching the stables almost without meaning to, drawn by the sound of voices, or rather, one voice, low and murmuring, so different from the clipped tones she had come to associate with her husband that she paused behind a tall hedge, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. Through a gap in the greenery she could see the stable-yard, and there was Henry, the Duke of Thornton, kneeling in the dirt in his shirt-sleeves, his coat discarded over a fence-rail, his attention fixed entirely upon a young chestnut horse that stood trembling before him, its ears pinned back, its eyes rolling with fear, its flanks dark with sweat despite the cool morning air. Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth, expecting him to rise, to bark orders at the stable hands who hovered at a careful distance, to handle the creature with the same cold efficiency he brought to everything else. But he did none of these things. Instead, he remained where he was, perfectly still, and spoke to the horse in a voice she had never heard him use, a voice like velvet, like the murmur of a stream over stones, patient and gentle, and impossibly tender. "Easy now," he was saying, his large hands held low and open, unthreatening. "Easy. There's nothing here that will hurt you. I promise you that. You're safe. You're safe." The horse snorted, stamped, but did not bolt. And Henry simply waited, speaking all the while in that same low, soothing tone, until slowly, so slowly Eleanor could barely perceive the change, the animal's trembling began to ease, its ears came forward, and it took one tentative step towards Sarn. The kneeling man, then another, until its velvet nose brushed against his outstretched palm, and he smiled. Actually smiled. A real smile that transformed his stern features into something almost boyish, and said, "There you are. There's my brave one, you see. Nothing to fear." Eleanor watched, transfixed, as he rose slowly to his feet, and ran his hand along the horse's neck with the same gentle patience, those same hands that had touched hers in the library, those same long fingers with the scar across the knuckles, and something shifted in her chest, something she refused to name but could not deny, a recognition that the cold duke the world saw was not the whole truth of this man, that beneath the ice there burned something warm and tender, and achingly human. Later, taking tea with the dowager in the morning-room, Eleanor found herself asking questions she had not meant to ask, questions about Henry's childhood, about the boy he had been before grief and duty had shaped him into the man he had become. And Margaret set down her cup with a knowing look, and spoke of a laughing child who had loved horses and poetry, and his mother above all things, who had been shattered by her death and frozen by his father's coldness, who had learned that to feel was to suffer, and so had taught himself not to feel at all. "He learned to survive by feeling nothing," the dowager said, her sharp eyes soft with old sorrow. "But the heart does not forget how to feel, my dear. It only forgets that it is allowed." Eleanor said nothing, but she thought of the man in the stable yard, kneeling in the dirt, gentling a frightened creature, with nothing but patience and kindness, and a voice like a promise, and she pressed her thumb to her wrist, and wondered if perhaps, just perhaps, she might be the one to remind him. The gardens at Thornton Hall had become a place of unexpected pleasure in the days since Eleanor had witnessed her husband's tenderness with the frightened horse, and she found herself walking the gravel paths with increasing frequency, telling herself it was merely for the fresh air and the beauty of the spring blooms, though she knew in her heart that she was hoping for exactly what seemed to happen with suspicious regularity, that Henry would appear as if by chance, falling into step beside her with a murmured greeting, and they would walk together in a companionship that grew easier with each passing day. Today the wind had risen, carrying with it the sweet scent of the white camellias that bloomed in profusion along the southern border, and Eleanor had paused to admire them, thinking as she always did of her mother's garden and the peace she had known there before everything changed, when a particularly fierce gust caught the edge of her bonnet and tore it from her head, sending it sailing through the air in a graceful arc that ended, with almost comic precision, directly in the centre of the ornamental fountain. She gasped, one hand flying to her now bare head, where the escaped curl near her left temple immediately began to dance in the wind, and she had taken perhaps 2 steps toward the fountain, already calculating how she might retrieve the wretched thing without ruining her dress, when Henry strode past her without a word, walked directly into the fountain with complete disregard for his immaculate boots and the water that rose nearly to his knees, and plucked the sodden bonnet from where it floated among the lily pads. He turned to face her, water streaming from his sleeve where he had reached elbow-deep to grasp the ribbons, and held the dripping, bedraggled thing before him with an expression of such profound and dignified outrage, his dark brows drawn together, his jaw set, his eyes fixed upon the offending headwear as though it had personally insulted his ancestors, that Eleanor felt something bubble up in her chest, something she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten its name, and before she could stop herself she was laughing, truly laughing, the sound escaping her in a rush that surprised her almost as much as it surprised him. Henry stared at her, the ruined bonnet still held before him like evidence of a crime, and for a long moment his expression did not change, and she thought perhaps she had offended him. But then slowly, so slowly she could watch it happen. The corners of his mouth began to curve. The tension in his jaw eased, and he laughed. A low, rusty sound, as though the mechanism had gone too long unused and needed oiling, but a laugh nonetheless, genuine and warm and utterly transforming. "I believe, Your Grace," he said, his voice still rough with mirth as he waded out of the fountain with as much dignity as a man with waterlogged boots could muster, "that your bonnet has committed an act of rebellion against the crown and must be dealt with accordingly." And he presented it to her with a bow so formal, so perfectly executed, despite the water dripping from his sleeve and the lily pad clinging to his boot, that Eleanor dissolved into laughter again, accepting the ruined thing with a curtsy equally exaggerated, and they stood there in the garden with the white camellias nodding in the wind around them. Two people who had forgotten how to laugh, remembering it together. And when Eleanor finally caught her breath and looked up at him, at the smile still lingering on his face and the warmth in his dark eyes, she felt something shift and settle in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. That night, lying in her bed in her beautiful chambers, she realized with a start that she had not thought of Clarence Whitmore in weeks, that the wound he had inflicted had begun, without her noticing, to heal. And she pressed her thumb to her wrist, not to steady herself against pain, but to feel her own pulse beating strong and sure, carrying her towards something she was only beginning to allow herself to imagine. The days that followed, the afternoon of the ruined bonnet, seemed to Eleanor to pass in a kind of golden haze, each one bringing some small new discovery about the man she had married, some quiet moment that added another thread to the tapestry being woven between them, and she found herself marking time not by the calendar, but by these accumulating intimacies. The evening he appeared in the library just as she was settling into her chair by the fire, and took the seat across from her without a word, opening his own book and reading in companionable silence until the candles burned low, or the morning she came down to breakfast to find a pot of her favourite tea waiting, the blend she had mentioned once in passing during their journey from London, a preference she had not even realized he had noted, and when she looked at him in surprise, he merely turned a page of his correspondence and said nothing, though she thought she caught the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. They visited the village together for the first time on a Thursday, bright with spring sunshine, and Eleanor watched with quiet wonder as the tenants greeted Henry, not with the fearful deference she might have expected, but with genuine respect, the blacksmith touching his cap and asking after the new foal, the vicar's wife pressing a jar of preserves into Eleanor's hands with warm wishes for the new duchess. And when a small girl of perhaps 5 years broke away from her mother and ran toward Eleanor with a fistful of wildflowers clutched in her grubby hand, Eleanor knelt to accept them with all the gravity she would have shown a royal gift. And when she rose and turned, she found Henry watching her with an expression that made something flutter beneath her ribs, his dark eyes soft in a way she had never seen in public, his thumb moving absently across the scar on his knuckles, as if he were not aware of the gesture at all. That afternoon, passing a shop window, she paused to admire a shawl displayed there, a lovely thing in a shade of green that reminded her of new leaves in spring, and she mentioned it only in passing, a idle observation, before they walked on. But that evening, returning to her sitting-room after dinner, she found a package wrapped in brown paper lying upon her dressing-table, and when she opened it, the shawl spilled out across her hands like water, soft as clouds, exactly the shade she had admired. There was no note, no acknowledgment at dinner when she searched his face for some sign. But the next morning, when she descended the stairs wearing it draped across her shoulders, she caught him looking at her from the doorway of his study, and for just a moment, before he schooled his features into their customary reserve, she saw something that might have been satisfaction, might have been pleasure, might have been something more, and she pressed her thumb to her wrist as she had done so many times before. But this time The gesture was not to steady herself against pain or fear. It was to feel her own, pulse beating strong and sure, carrying her towards something she was only beginning to allow herself to imagine, something that felt dangerously, wonderfully like hope. The house had grown quiet in the way that only very late hours could bring, that particular stillness that settled over grand estates when the servants had retired and the fires had burned low, and Eleanor found herself unable to sleep, her mind too full of green shawls and softened expressions, and the way his laugh had sounded in the garden, that rusty, beautiful sound she could not stop hearing in her memory. And so she rose from her bed and wrapped herself in her dressing gown and made her way through the darkened corridors toward the library, thinking only of finding a book to quiet her restless thoughts. But when she pushed open the heavy door, she found she was not alone. Henry stood before the fireplace, his back to her, still dressed though his cravat had been loosened and his coat discarded, and he was gazing up at a portrait she had somehow never noticed in all her hours spent among these shelves, a portrait of a woman with dark eyes and a gentle smile, and something in the set of his shoulders, in the absolute stillness of his posture, made Eleanor pause on the threshold, uncertain whether to retreat or advance. But before she could decide, he spoke without turning, his voice low and rough in the darkness. I cannot remember the sound of her voice any more. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with a grief so old it had become part of him, and Eleanor remained where she stood, scarcely breathing, as he continued in that same halting way she had come to recognize as his manner when he spoke of things that mattered, things that cost him something to say. She smelled of roses. I remember that. The way the scent would cling to her when she held me. The way her hands were always warm when she touched my face. But her voice, the particular sound of it, the way she said my name. He trailed off, his thumb moving across the scar on his knuckles in that gesture she had come to know so well, and Eleanor found herself moving toward him without conscious decision, her bare feet silent on the carpet, until she stood beside him and could see his profile illuminated by the dying firelight, could see the way his jaw was tight with the effort of containing something vast and painful. She was the last person to touch me with affection, he said, and then stopped, and the sentence hung unfinished between them, trembling with all the words he could not say, and Eleanor understood with sudden, aching clarity what he had almost admitted, that she, Eleanor, had become something to him, had touched something in him that had been untouched for 20 years. She did not reach for him, sensing that he was not ready, that this moment required witness rather than comfort, but she stayed, close enough that she could smell the sandalwood and cedar that had become the scent of safety, and she told him about her own mother, about the white camellias that had grown beneath her bedroom window, about how she still sometimes caught a hint of her mother's perfume on old letters and wept. Grief does not diminish love, she said softly, her grey-green eyes fixed on the portrait of the woman who had shaped the man beside her. It proves it. And when he finally turned to look at her, his eyes were not impenetrable, not guarded, not the cold dark she had first encountered in a London drawing-room. They were the colour of aged brandy, warm and deep, and full of something that made her press her thumb to her wrist, though whether to steady herself or to feel her own heart beating, she could not have said. The invitation arrived on a morning bright with spring sunshine, its heavy cream paper and elegant script, announcing what Eleanor had been dreading since the day she became the Duchess of Thornton. A ball in London, hosted by the Countess of Pemberton, the very woman in whose garden Eleanor's world had shattered 3 years before, and as she held the card in trembling fingers, she felt the old familiar dread rise in her chest like floodwater, the memory of whispers and pitying glances, and the long walk to her carriage with her dignity held together by nothing but sheer will, and she must have made some sound, because Henry looked up from his correspondence across the breakfast table, his dark eyes sharpening with that particular attention she had come to recognize, the way he seemed to see through her careful composure to the fear beneath. "We need not attend," he said, his voice carrying that clipped quality she now understood was not coldness but restraint, the way he held himself back when he wished to say more. And Eleanor shook her head, because she knew they must, knew that hiding at Thornton Hall forever was not truly living, knew that sooner or later she must face the world that had witnessed her humiliation. But knowing did not stop her hands from shaking, did not quiet the voice in her mind that whispered she would always be the woman Clarence Whitmore had declared unlovable before half of London society. 3 days later, on the afternoon before their departure, Eleanor sat at her dressing table while Mrs. Dawson arranged her hair, trying not to think about what awaited her, when a knock came at her door, and Henry entered carrying something draped across his arms, something that caught the light from the window and shimmered like water. And when he laid it across her bed, she saw it was a gown, the most beautiful gown she had ever seen, cut in the latest fashion from silk, the precise shade of deep forest green that matched her eyes, and she looked up at him with questions she could not voice. "You will outshine them all," he said quietly, his jaw tight in that way she had learned meant he was struggling with something he could not easily express, and then, lower still, with a fierceness that made her breath catch. "And if anyone dares to slight you, they will answer to me." The ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles when they arrived, and Eleanor felt every eye turn toward them as they descended the stairs, felt the whispers begin like wind through autumn leaves. But this time Henry's arm was steady beneath her gloved hand, his presence beside her solid as stone, and she held her head high and let them look. Let them see the green gown that made her eyes shine like the winter sea. Let them see the Duke of Thornton, with his hand covering hers in a gesture that spoke of possession and protection both. The Dowager Duchess, Margaret, resplendent in purple silk, beamed at them from across the room, and beside her stood a man Eleanor did not recognize, tall and fair-haired with laughing eyes, who took one look at Henry and exclaimed loud enough for half the room to hear, "Good God, Thornton, I do believe you just smiled. Someone mark the date. I shall need proof when I tell this tale." And Henry's mouth curved in that way Eleanor had come to treasure, that reluctant warmth he showed so rarely in public, as he introduced Lord Thomas Sinclair, his oldest friend, who bowed over Eleanor's hand with exaggerated gallantry, and declared himself entirely unsurprised that Thornton had managed to find the only woman in England capable of thawing his frozen heart. The evening might have been perfect, might have been everything Eleanor had feared it would not be, had she not looked across the crowded ballroom at precisely the wrong moment and seen them. Lord Clarence Whitmore, heavier now and somehow diminished, his golden hair thinner than she remembered, and beside him a woman of cold classical beauty who looked at her husband with barely concealed contempt, Lady Augusta Whitmore, the heiress he had chosen over Eleanor, the fortune he had deemed more valuable than love. And as Eleanor watched, frozen, Clarence's pale blue eyes found hers across the sea of dancers, and something ugly flickered in their depths, something that made her hand tighten convulsively on Henry's arm as Clarence began moving toward them through the crowd, Augusta trailing behind with an expression of bored indifference, and Eleanor's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird as the man who had destroyed her approached with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Clarence Whitmore approached with the measured stride of a man who believed himself untouchable, his smile fixed upon his face in that particular way Eleanor remembered so well, the way it curved his lips without ever reaching his pale blue eyes, and she felt the old familiar dread rise in her throat like bile as he stopped before them, Augusta trailing behind with an expression of profound boredom, her beautiful face as cold and remote as marble. And when Clarence spoke, His voice carried that same honeyed poison she had heard 3 years ago in Lady Pemberton's garden, the same false warmth that had once made her believe herself loved. "How remarkable to see you so elevated, Miss Ashworth. Forgive me, your grace," he said, and the correction dripped with mockery, his gaze travelling over her green gown with something ugly flickering in its depths. "Though I suppose even the most unlovable woman can find a buyer if the price is right." The word hung in the air between them, unlovable, and Eleanor felt it strike her like a physical blow, felt the whispers beginning around them like wind through dead leaves, felt her hand tighten convulsively on Henry's arm as the old shame threatened to swallow her whole. But before she could speak, before she could do anything at all, Henry stepped forward, and the temperature in the ballroom seemed to drop by several degrees. "You will apologize to my wife." His voice was ice, controlled and precise, each word falling into the sudden silence like stones into still water. And Clarence laughed nervously, that high, brittle sound of a man who had miscalculated badly and was only beginning to realize it, tried to wave away the demand with one soft, ring-laden hand. "Come now, Thornton. Surely you can appreciate a bit of harmless—" "I appreciate nothing about you, Whitmore," Henry cut him off, and though he did not raise his voice, it carried to every corner of the hushed ballroom, his dark eyes burning with a cold fury that made Eleanor's breath catch. "You are speaking of the Duchess of Thornton, a woman of more grace, intelligence, and worth than you could ever comprehend with your shallow, mercenary mind, and you found her unlovable, because you are utterly incapable of recognizing love, incapable of feeling it, incapable of inspiring it. You are a small, petty, insignificant man, and your opinion is worth precisely nothing." The silence that followed was absolute, every eye in the ballroom fixed upon them, and Eleanor watched the colour drain from Clarence's face as the full weight of his humiliation settled upon him, watched Augusta turn and walk away without a word, abandoning him to the wreckage of his own cruelty. And then Henry turned to Eleanor and offered his hand, and his voice when he spoke was low and tender, and meant only for her. "Dance with me, my love." The endearment, the first he had ever used, rang through the silence like a bell, and Eleanor took his hand and let him lead her onto the floor as the musicians, recovering themselves, began to play. And as they moved together through the first steps of the waltz, she realized her eyes were wet with tears she could not stop, realized his hand on her waist was warm and steady and sure, realized that she had never in her life felt so seen, so defended, so utterly and completely valued. And across the room Clarence Whitmore stood alone and destroyed, while the whispers now were not about Eleanor at all, but about him, about the fool who had discarded a diamond and called it worthless. And Eleanor pressed closer to her husband, and let the music carry them both. The carriage rolled through the darkened streets of London, with a gentle rocking motion that seemed at odds with the tempest still raging in Eleanor's chest. And she sat across from Henry, in the velvet-cushioned interior, watching the play of lamplight across his features as they passed beneath the gas lamps, unable to find words adequate to express what she felt, what he had done for her, how completely he had shattered every expectation she had ever held about this marriage and this man. And when she finally spoke, her voice emerged smaller than she intended, almost lost beneath the clatter of hooves on cobblestones. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt laughably insufficient, a teacup offered to contain an ocean. But Henry's dark eyes found hers in the dimness and held them, and she saw something fierce burning in their depths, something that made her breath catch and her heart pound against her ribs. "No one will ever speak to you that way again," he said, and his voice was low and rough, stripped of its usual careful control, vibrating with an intensity that seemed to fill the small space between them. "Not while I draw breath." She stared at him. This man who had offered her a practical arrangement and nothing more. This man who had promised her comfort and security and protection, but never warmth, never passion, never the fierce defense of a husband who valued his wife beyond measure. And she realized with a clarity that stole her breath that he was not performing duty, not fulfilling the terms of their agreement, but was genuinely, profoundly angry on her behalf, protective in a way that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with something she was terrified to name. "You called me your love," she whispered, and the words hung between them in the darkness, fragile as spun glass, and she watched his jaw tighten in that way she had come to recognize, watched his thumb move across the scar on his knuckles, in the gesture that meant he was struggling with something he could not easily express. He was silent for a long moment, so long that she thought perhaps he would not answer at all, and then he said, his voice dropping to barely more than a murmur, "It seemed appropriate." And he did not meet her eyes, turning instead to look out the window at the passing streets, and Eleanor pressed her thumb to the inside of her wrist and felt her pulse racing beneath her skin. When they arrived at Thornton Hall, the great house rising before them in the moonlight, Henry handed her down from the carriage with careful formality, but his fingers lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary, and she felt the warmth of his touch, even through her gloves, felt it spread through her like wine. He walked her through the silent halls to her chambers, their footsteps echoing on the marble floors, and at her door he paused, and she saw his hand rise toward her face, saw his fingers hover near her cheek, where the escaped curl had come loose near her left temple, and then his hand dropped to his side, and he stepped back. "Good night, Eleanor," he said, and her name in his voice, her Christian name spoken for the first time, was like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed, and before she could respond, he had turned and walked away, his long strides carrying him into the shadows, and she stood in her doorway with her heart pounding, and her hand pressed to her wrist, and a feeling rising in her chest that she could no longer deny. The next morning, Mrs. Dawson found her sitting at her dressing table, staring at nothing. The silver bracelet she did not yet possess, already a phantom weight on her wrist. And the older woman's knowing eyes studied her with the particular perception of someone who had watched her grow from child to woman. "You are falling in love with him," Mrs. Dawson said, and it was not a question. And Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, because the truth of it was terrifying, because she had promised herself she would never be so foolish again, because loving someone meant giving them the power to destroy her. "I am frightened," Eleanor admitted, her voice barely a whisper, and Mrs. Dawson came to stand behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror with an expression of fierce maternal tenderness. "If I may say so, my lady, a man's character shows not in his words at a ball, but in his silence when he thinks no one observes. And you have observed him, have you not, with the horses and the camellias and the shawl and 100 small kindnesses he never expected you to notice?" Eleanor nodded, unable to speak, and Mrs. Dawson's hand came to rest on her shoulder with gentle pressure. "He has shown you who he is, my lady, in every way that matters, and perhaps it is time to believe him." The days that followed their return to Thornton Hall unfolded like the slow opening of a flower, each hour bringing some new tenderness that Eleanor had not dared to imagine possible, and she found herself watching for Henry, with an eagerness that would have shamed her only weeks before, listening for his footsteps in the corridor, turning toward the door of whatever room she occupied, with her heart quickening at the possibility that he might enter. And he did enter again and again, seeking her company with an openness that spoke louder than any declaration, appearing in the library where she read, joining her for walks through the gardens, where the white camellias bloomed in profusion, sitting beside her in the drawing-room in the evenings when the fire burned low and the house grew quiet around them. He read aloud to her now, his deep voice wrapping around the words of poets and philosophers, and she discovered that he had a gift for it, that the same voice that could command a ballroom into silence could also soften into something intimate and warm, could make Shakespeare's sonnets feel like letters written just for her. And when he reached the lines about love that alters not when it alteration finds, his dark eyes would lift from the page and find hers, and she would feel her breath catch in her throat at what she saw in their depths. He touched her more freely now, small gestures that accumulated like coins in a treasury she had not known she possessed. His hand at the small of her back as they walked, his fingers brushing hers when he passed her a cup of tea, his palm warm against her shoulder when he adjusted the green shawl she wore almost daily now, because she had seen how his gaze lingered upon it. And each touch sent warmth spreading through her like sunlight through glass. Each contact left her wanting more. One afternoon, walking among the white camellias that reminded her so fiercely of her mother, Henry spoke of his past with an openness that made her chest ache. His father's coldness after his mother's death, the way he had learned to armor himself against feeling, the broken engagement to a woman who had wanted only his title, and whose death had left him believing himself incapable of inspiring genuine affection. "I thought it was a deficiency in me," he admitted, his voice low and rough, his thumb moving across the scar on his knuckles in that gesture she had come to know so well. "That I was made wrong somehow, that there was something missing in my constitution that rendered me unfit for love." She wanted to tell him then, wanted to reach out and take his face in her hands and make him understand that he was not deficient, that he was not made wrong, that she loved him with a ferocity that frightened her. But the words caught in her throat, and she could only press her thumb to her wrist and look at him with eyes that surely betrayed everything she felt. That night, alone in her chambers with the moonlight pooling on her counterpane, Eleanor finally admitted the truth she had been fighting since the moment he had called her his love in that silent ballroom. She loved him, completely and desperately, and against every promise she had made to herself, loved him for his patience with frightened horses, and his rusty laugh and his silent gifts left without acknowledgment, loved him for the way he had defended her honor, and the way he watched her when he thought she did not notice, and she knew with terrible clarity that she could not continue in this exquisite agony of almost, that she must find the courage to tell him or spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. The storm had been building all day, a pressure in the air that Eleanor felt in her very bones, and as evening fell and the first distant rumbles of thunder rolled across the Derbyshire hills, she stood before the mirror in her chambers and knew with absolute certainty that tonight was the night she would tell him. Tonight she would find the courage that had eluded her for weeks. Tonight she would risk everything on the chance that the man who had called her his love before all of London society might actually mean those words in the way she so desperately hoped. Mrs. Dawson helped her dress in the silver-grey gown, the one that matched her eyes, the one she had been saving without knowing quite what she was saving it for, and as the older woman fastened the last button, their eyes met in the mirror with an understanding that required no words. "You look beautiful, my lady," Mrs. Dawson said softly, and then, with the knowing smile of someone who had watched Eleanor grow from a girl into a woman, "He will not be able to look away." Eleanor pressed her thumb to her wrist, feeling her pulse flutter beneath her skin like a caged bird, and descended the stairs into the quiet house, the thunder growing closer now, the air heavy with the promise of rain. She checked his study first, but it stood empty. The papers on his desk weighted down as if in anticipation of the storm to come, and the drawing-room, too, was dark and silent, the fire unlit, and she moved through the great house like a woman in a dream, searching for the man she had married without love and grown to love without meaning to. The library door stood slightly ajar, and golden lamplight spilled through the gap, and Eleanor paused, with her hand on the polished wood, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it, and then she pushed the door open and stepped inside. He was standing by the tall windows, watching the storm roll in across the darkened grounds, his profile illuminated by a flash of lightning that turned his features to marble and shadow. And when he turned at the sound of her entrance, the expression on his face made her heart stop entirely, something raw and unguarded, something that looked almost like hope, something that made his dark eyes warm to the color of aged brandy in the lamplight. "Eleanor," he said, and her name in his voice was low and rough, stripped of all pretense, and then softer. "I was hoping you might come." The storm broke outside as if in answer, rain lashing against the windows with sudden violence, and they stood there in the library, where their fingers had first touched over a book of poetry, where he had shown her his grief before his mother's portrait, where everything between them had been built moment by careful moment. And Eleanor took a breath that felt like the first breath of a new life. "Henry," she said, and her voice did not waver. "I need to tell you something." Eleanor opened her mouth to speak the words she had carried with her down the stairs and through the empty corridors, the confession that burned in her chest like a living flame. But before she could give voice to a single syllable, Henry raised his hand, and the gesture stopped her, as surely as if he had placed his fingers against her lips. "Wait," he said, and his voice was rough, stripped of the careful control she had come to know so well. "Please, I must—" He turned away from her, facing the window where lightning split the sky and illuminated the rain-lashed gardens below, and she watched his thumb move across the scar on his knuckles in that gesture she had learned to read as clearly as words upon a page, the gesture that meant he was struggling with something too large to contain. "There is a sonnet," he said, and his voice was so low she had to step closer to hear him over the thunder, "that I have carried with me since the day I first saw you in this room, sitting in the chair by the window, with a book of poetry in your hands, and the afternoon light turning your hair to copper and gold." He paused, and she could see the tension in his broad shoulders, the way his hands clenched at his sides. "Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove." The words of Sonnet 116 fell from his lips like a prayer, like a confession, and Eleanor felt her heart stop in her chest as he turned to face her at last, his dark eyes no longer impenetrable, but blazing with something that stole her breath. "I did not understand those words then," he continued, and his voice cracked on the admission. "I thought love was something that happened to other people, something I was incapable of inspiring or feeling, a deficiency in my very nature that no amount of wealth or title could repair." He took a step toward her, and then another, and she could smell sandalwood and cedar, could feel the warmth radiating from his body despite the chill of the storm-swept room. "I told you once that I would give you everything within my power and ask nothing in return," he said, and his thumb pressed hard against his scar. "I find I must break that vow, Eleanor. I must ask something of you now. I must ask if there is any possibility, any chance at all, that you might one day—" His voice failed him then, the sentence hanging unfinished in the charged air between them, and Eleanor understood with sudden, blazing clarity that this man who commanded ballrooms and silenced viscounts with a word could not find the courage to finish asking if she might love him. She closed the distance between them in 3 swift steps, reaching up to cup his face in her hands, feeling the slight roughness of his jaw beneath her palms, and the words poured from her like water finally released from a dam. "I already do," she said, and her voice was steady, even as tears pricked at her eyes. "I love you, Henry, not for your title or your protection, or the security you have given me, but for you, for the man who kneels in the dirt, to gentle, frightened horses, who laughs like he has forgotten how, and then remembers, who leaves white camellias on my dressing table without a word, who defends my honour before all of London, and reads poetry as if the words were written just for us. She felt his breath catch beneath her hands, saw his eyes widen with something that looked almost like wonder. "I love you," she repeated, completely and desperately, and against every promise I ever made to myself, and the only foolishness would be to deny it any longer. For one endless moment he simply stared at her, as if she had spoken in a language he did not know, and then his arms came around her, and he pulled her against his chest, and his mouth found hers in a kiss that was nothing like the gentle, tentative thing she might have imagined. It was fierce and hungry and full of every word he had never been able to say, and she kissed him back with equal fervour, her fingers threading through his dark hair as the storm raged beyond the windows, and the library that had witnessed their first touch now witnessed this, the breaking of every wall between them. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, he pressed his forehead to hers, and his voice was barely a whisper. "I love you, Eleanor," he said. "I think I have loved you since the moment you asked me why I chose you and looked at me as if my answer actually mattered." Outside, the thunder rolled on, but inside the library, in the circle of his arms, everything was finally perfectly still. They stood there in the library, with the storm still raging beyond the windows, his forehead pressed to hers, and their breath mingling in the space between them, and Eleanor thought she might never need to move again, might be content to remain in this perfect stillness for the rest of her days. But then Henry drew back just enough to look at her face, and his expression held something she had never seen before, a vulnerability so complete it made her heart ache with tenderness. "I have something for you," he said, and his voice was rough, uncertain in a way that seemed impossible from a man who commanded ballrooms and silenced viscounts with a word. "I have been carrying it for weeks, waiting for... I did not know if you would ever..." He stopped, shook his head at his own inability to finish, and reached into the pocket of his waistcoat to withdraw a small velvet box that he pressed into her trembling hands. Eleanor opened it, and her breath caught at the sight of the delicate silver bracelet within, a chain so fine it seemed almost ethereal, set with a single stone that caught the lamplight and glowed with the precise colour of a winter sea, grey and green and shifting with depth. And she understood at once what it meant, understood that he had looked at her eyes and seen something worth capturing in silver and stone, something worth keeping. "Nothing existed before you wore it," Henry said softly, taking the bracelet from its box and clasping it around her wrist with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly. "It was made only for you, Eleanor. It belonged to no one before you, because there was no one before you. Not truly, not in any way that mattered." She looked at the stone resting against her pulse point, felt the cool weight of silver warming against her skin, and when she raised her eyes to his, she found them the colour of aged brandy, full of a love so profound it seemed impossible that she had ever thought him cold. He took her hand then, the hand that wore his bracelet, and led her from the library through the quiet corridors of the great house while the storm gentled outside, the thunder rolling away across the Derbyshire hills and the rain softening to a whisper against the windows. And she went with him willingly, her heart so full she thought it might overflow. In his chambers, in the warm glow of firelight, he touched her with a reverence that undid her completely, his large hands impossibly gentle as they traced the lines of her face, her shoulders, the curve of her waist, and when he whispered her name against her skin, it was a prayer and a promise, and a homecoming all at once. She had promised herself she would never love him, she remembered, as his arms wrapped around her and drew her close. She had been so certain that to love was to invite fresh humiliation, fresh pain. But she had been wrong. She had been loving him for weeks. perhaps from the very beginning, when he had looked at her with those dark, impenetrable eyes, and offered her honesty instead of performance, and the only foolishness would have been to deny it any longer. Afterward, she lay in his arms, listening to the rain and the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, the bracelet cool against her wrist, and for the first time in 3 years, 1,096 days of believing herself unlovable, Eleanor Ashworth was not afraid. The grandest ball of the season glittered before them like a jewel box thrown open to the summer night, chandeliers blazing with 1,000 candles that cast their golden light across silk gowns and polished floors, and Eleanor stood at the entrance of the Pemberton Ballroom on Henry's arm, feeling as though she had stepped into a dream from which she never wished to wake, for everything was different now. Everything had changed in ways she could not have imagined 2 months ago, when she had last stood in this very room and watched her husband defend her honour before all of London society. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that matched the stone on her bracelet, the bracelet that had not left her wrist since the night he had clasped it there in the library, while the storm raged outside, and their confessions hung sweet and trembling in the air between them, and she felt his hand warm and steady at the small of her back as they descended the stairs into the swirling crowd of dancers and observers and whispered conversations that fell momentarily silent at their approach. The whispers were different now, she noticed with a quiet thrill of satisfaction that she would not have permitted herself to feel a year ago. They were not the cruel murmurs of pity and schadenfreude that had followed her through ballrooms for 3 long years, but something else entirely, something that sounded almost like admiration, almost like envy. And when she caught fragments of conversation as they passed, she heard phrases like utterly devoted and transformed beyond recognition, and have you seen the way he looks at her, that made warmth bloom in her chest, like the white camellias that now filled the gardens at Thornton Hall. Henry led her onto the dance floor without asking, without needing to ask, and as his hand settled at her waist and his dark eyes met hers, she thought of the first time they had danced in this room, the night he had called her "my love" for the first time, and she had not known whether to believe it was real, and she smiled up at him with all the joy she no longer tried to hide. "You are radiant tonight," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear, and his eyes were the colour of aged brandy in the candlelight, warm and open in a way that still made her breath catch, even after 2 months of waking in his arms. "I am happy," she replied simply, and watched his expression soften further still, watched the man whom society had once called cold and impenetrable smile at her, as though she were the only person in the room, and across the ballroom floor she caught the dowager's eye, and saw the old woman's lips curve into a knowing smile before she mouthed quite distinctly, "I told you so." Lord Thomas appeared at the edge of the dance floor as the music swelled, raising his glass in their direction with theatrical flourish, and she heard him announce to his companions, "A toast to the woman who taught Thornton to smile. May we all find someone who looks at us the way he looks at her." And the laughter that followed was warm and genuine, and nothing like the cruel amusement that had once echoed through these halls at her expense. It was then that Eleanor glimpsed them across the room, Clarence and Augusta Whitmore, standing at the periphery of the festivities with matching expressions of sour discontent, he grown heavier and somehow diminished in a way that had nothing to do with his physical form. She beautiful still, but cold as marble, and twice as unyielding, and they did not approach, did not dare to approach, merely watched with something like bitter incomprehension as Eleanor danced past in her husband's arms. She felt a flicker of something that might have been pity once, but she released it as easily as breath, for she understood now what Clarence never would, that love was not a transaction to be calculated, not a commodity to be weighed and measured, but a gift freely given and gratefully received, and she had what he would never possess, because he was incapable of recognizing its worth. Henry noticed the direction of her gaze and drew her closer, his arm tightening around her waist, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "You are thinking of him." Eleanor looked up at her husband, at the man who had gentled frightened horses and left camellias without notes and quoted Shakespeare in the storm-lit dark, and she smiled. "I was thinking," she said, "of how grateful I am that he did not want me, because it meant I was free for you." 5 years had passed since the night of the storm. 5 years since Eleanor had stood in the library with rain lashing the windows and confessed a love she had sworn never to feel, and now she walked through the gardens of Thornton Hall on a late spring morning with their daughter balanced on her hip, the child's dark eyes, so like her father's, wide with wonder at the white camellias that bloomed in profusion along every path. For Henry had ordered the gardens expanded at Eleanor's request, until the flowers her mother had loved seemed to spill from every corner of the estate, like living memory made beautiful. Ahead of them, their son ran with the boundless energy of a 4-year-old boy, his grey-green eyes, the colour of a winter sea, the colour of his mother's eyes, the colour of the stone in the bracelet that still circled Eleanor's wrist and had not left it since the night it was clasped there, bright with excitement as he spotted his father emerging from the stables, and the sound that followed made Eleanor's heart swell with a joy so profound it still surprised her even after all these years. Henry's laugh, full and warm and nothing like the rusty, forgotten sound she had first heard by the fountain when her bonnet had sailed into the water, rang across the garden as he caught their son and swung him high into the air. She watched them together, her husband and her boy, and remembered the man who had stood before her in that London drawing-room and spoken of arrangements and practicality with a voice that never warmed, the man who had believed himself incapable of inspiring love, and she marvelled at how thoroughly she had proven him wrong, how thoroughly they had proven each other wrong, for she had been just as certain that she would never love again, that to hope was to invite fresh humiliation. And yet here she stood in a garden full of white camellias, with a daughter in her arms, and a son running toward her with grass-stained knees, and a husband whose eyes still warmed to the colour of aged brandy every time he looked at her. From the terrace, the dowager watched with Mrs. Dawson at her side. Both women older now, but no less sharp, and Eleanor caught the knowing look that passed between them as Henry approached with their son on his shoulders, and reached for their daughter with the practised ease of a man who had learned that tenderness was not weakness but strength, that love was not a cage but a door he had finally remembered how to open. That evening, after the children were asleep in the nursery and the house had settled into its comfortable quiet, Eleanor found Henry in the library, their library, where their fingers had first brushed over a volume of poetry, where he had confessed he could not remember his mother's voice, where he had quoted Shakespeare and broken his vow, and kissed her while the storm raged outside. And she curled into the chair beside his, and watched him read until he looked up and caught her gaze and smiled the smile that still made her breath catch. "What are you thinking?" he asked, and she told him. She was thinking of the woman she had been 5 years ago, who had believed herself unlovable, who had expected nothing more than security and silence from this marriage, and she was thinking of how grateful she was. Not that Clarence Whitmore had rejected her, though she was grateful for that too, but grateful for the courage to stay when she might have retreated, grateful for the patience to see beyond his walls, grateful for the love that had grown between them like the white camellias in the garden, quiet and steady, and more beautiful with each passing year. Henry set aside his book and reached for her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar shape of the bracelet at her wrist, the grey-green stone catching the firelight as it had caught the lightning on the night he had first clasped it there, and Eleanor felt the same warmth bloom in her chest that she had felt in that moment 5 years ago, the same certainty that she had found something rare and precious and worth every moment of pain that had led her to it. "I was thinking," she continued, her voice soft in the quiet of the library, where the scent of old books and sandalwood wrapped around them like a beloved memory. Of how I once promised myself I would never love you, and how spectacularly I failed at keeping that promise, and how grateful I am for that failure every single day. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her palm, and his eyes, those dark eyes that society had once called impenetrable, but that she had learned to read as easily as the worn pages of her mother's sonnets, were warm with the same love that had transformed both their lives, the same love that echoed now in their children's laughter, and in the white camellias that bloomed throughout the gardens, and in every small gesture he still made without acknowledgment, still expecting nothing in return. "You taught me that I was not made wrong," he said quietly, and his voice was the low velvet murmur that belonged only to her, only to these moments when the walls he had built so carefully around his heart lay in beautiful ruins at her feet. "You taught me that the door I had forgotten existed was worth opening, and I will spend the rest of my life grateful that you were brave enough to walk through it." Eleanor leaned into him, feeling his arm come around her as naturally as breathing, and she thought of Mrs. Dawson's words about a man's character showing in his silence, of the dowager's prediction that she would be the one to prove Henry capable of love, of the storm-lit confession and the bracelet made only for her, and the thousand small moments that had built this life they shared. And she knew with absolute certainty that she had been given something Clarence Whitmore would never understand, something that could not be bought or calculated or weighed against a dowry. She had been chosen not for what she could provide, but for who she was, and in being chosen she had found the courage to choose in return, to love without reservation, to trust without fear, and the woman who had once counted her days in humiliation now counted them in joy, in laughter, in the weight of her daughter in her arms, and the sound of her son's voice calling for his father, and the steady presence of the man beside her who had given her everything and asked for nothing but her heart. Thank you for walking this journey with Eleanor and Henry, for believing in love that grows from respect and trust rather than instant passion, and for remembering that sometimes the greatest romances begin not with a spark, but with a choice, made again and again, until choosing becomes as natural as breathing and as essential as hope itself.